The old soldier's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the abandoned barracks. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the wind carried whispers that seemed to echo from a distant past. The place had been his home during the war, a place of camaraderie, fear, and ultimately tragedy. Now, decades later, he had returned, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. Colonel James Hargrove, now in his late 90s, had survived the Second World War, but the memories of those years had never left him. The barracks, once bustling with life, stood as a hollow shell of its former self. The windows were shattered, the walls covered in ivy, and the iron gates rusted and creaked as he pushed them open. He stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. Chapter 1: The Return. The main hall was dark, the only light coming from the broken windows. Dust swirled in the air, and the sound of his footsteps echoed eerily. James remembered the laughter, the drills, the camaraderie. But now the silence was oppressive. He walked through the corridors, his hand brushing against the cold, damp walls. The place felt alive as if it were watching him. He reached the mess hall, where he and his comrades had shared meals and stories. The tables and chairs were overturned, and the floor was littered with debris. As he stood there, he heard a faint whisper. "James?" His blood ran cold. It was a voice he hadn't heard in decades. Sergeant Tom Wilkins, his closest friend, who had died in combat. "Tom?" James called out, his voice trembling. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "James, why did you leave us?" Chapter 2: The Voices. James stumbled backward, his heart racing. The whispers grew into a chorus of voices, all familiar, all accusing. "You survived, but we didn't." He recognized them: Corporal Danny Mills, Private Pete Carter, Lieutenant Henry Blake. All of them had died in the war, and now their voices surrounded him. He turned and ran, but the voices followed him, growing louder and more menacing. He reached the barracks' old armory where they had stored their weapons. The door was ajar, and he pushed it open, desperate to escape the voices. Inside, the room was eerily silent. The racks that once held rifles were empty, and the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. As he stood there, he heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. He turned to see a figure standing in the corner, a shadowy silhouette that slowly stepped into the light. It was Tom, his face pale and gaunt, his uniform tattered and blood-stained. "Tom?" James whispered, his voice barely audible. "You left us, James?" Tom said, his voice filled with sorrow and anger. "You survived, but we were left behind." Chapter 3: The Confrontation. James backed away, his mind racing. "I didn't mean to. I couldn't save you." "You could have tried," another voice said. James turned to see Danny and Pete standing behind him, their faces twisted in pain and rage. "You could have fought harder," Danny said. "But you ran." "No," James shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "I didn't run. I fought. I did everything I could." "Did you?" Henry Blake's voice was cold and accusing. "Or did you just save yourself?" James felt a surge of guilt and fear. He had always wondered if he could have done more, if he could have saved his friends. And now their ghosts were here to confront him. Chapter 4: The Descent. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in around him. The ghosts of his friends stepped closer, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. James felt a cold hand grip his shoulder, and he turned to see Tom's face inches from his own. "You belong with us, James," Tom whispered. "You always have." James struggled to break free, but the grip was too strong. He felt himself being dragged into the darkness, the voices of his friends growing louder and more insistent. "Join us, join us." Chapter 5. The Revelation. As the darkness enveloped him, James saw flashes of the past. The battles, the deaths, the moments of fear and despair. He saw himself running, leaving his friends behind. He saw their faces as they fell, their eyes filled with betrayal. And then he saw the truth. He hadn't survived the war. He had died on the battlefield just like his friends. But his soul had refused to move on, clinging to the hope that he had survived. Now the ghosts of his friends had come to claim him, to bring him to where he truly belonged. Chapter 6. The End. James opened his eyes to find himself standing in the middle of the battlefield, the sounds of gunfire and explosions all around him. His friends were there, their faces filled with relief. "Welcome back, James," Tom said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We've been waiting for you." James looked down and saw his own body, lying lifeless on the ground. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that he was finally where he was meant to be. The war was over and he was with his friends once more. As the darkness closed in, the barracks stood silent and empty, a monument to the lives that had been lost and the souls that had finally found peace. Years later, a group of urban explorers stumbled upon the abandoned barracks. They found the main hall, the mess hall, the armory, all untouched as if frozen in time. But as they ventured deeper into the building, they heard faint whispers, the sound of footsteps and the distant echoes of laughter. They left quickly, never to return. But the stories of the haunted barracks lived on, a chilling reminder of the past and the souls that still lingered within its walls. And somewhere in the darkness, the ghosts of James Hargrove and his comrades watched and waited, bound together for eternity. Chapter 7. The Legacy. The legend of the haunted barracks spread far and wide, becoming a tale told around campfires and in hushed tones. People claimed to see shadows moving in the windows, to hear the distant sound of marching feet, and to feel an overwhelming sense of dread when they approached the gates. One night, a group of historians decided to investigate the barracks, hoping to uncover the truth behind the legends. They brought with them cameras, recording equipment, and a determination to document whatever they found. As they entered the main hall, the air grew colder and the whispers began. The historians pressed on, their fear masked by curiosity. They reached the mess hall, where the tables and chairs were still overturned, and the floor was littered with debris. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The historians turned to see shadowy figures emerging from the darkness. James Hargrove and his comrades, their faces filled with sorrow and anger. "Leave this place," James said, his voice echoing through the hall. "You do not belong here." The historians fled, their equipment abandoned in their haste. They never spoke of what they had seen, but the recordings they left behind captured the voices of the ghosts, their pleas for peace and their warnings to stay away. Chapter 8. The Final Rest. Years passed, and the barracks remained abandoned, a place of fear and mystery. But one day, A young woman named Emily, the great-granddaughter of James Hargrove, decided to visit the barracks. She had grown up hearing stories of her great-grandfather's bravery and the tragedy that had befallen him and his comrades. As she approached the gates, she felt a sense of calm, as if the place were welcoming her. She stepped inside, the air warm and the whispers gentle. She reached the mess hall, where the tables and chairs were now upright, and the floor was clean. "James," she called out, her voice filled with love and respect. "I'm here." The shadows parted, and James Hargrove emerged, his face filled with relief and gratitude. "Emily," he said, his voice soft and gentle. "You've come." "I've come to bring you peace," she said. "You and your friends. It's time to rest." James nodded, and the ghosts of his comrades appeared, their faces filled with relief. Emily led them out of the barracks, the gates closing behind them with a final, resounding clang. Chapter 9: The Peace. The barracks stood silent and empty once more, but the air was now filled with a sense of peace. The ghosts of James Hargrove and his comrades had finally found rest, their souls at peace after decades of torment. Emily returned home, her heart filled with a sense of fulfillment. She had brought peace to her great-grandfather and his comrades, and their legacy would live on, not as a tale of horror, but as a story of bravery, sacrifice, and ultimately peace. Chapter 10: The Memorial. Years later, a memorial was erected at the site of the barracks, honoring the lives of James Hargrove and his comrades. The plaque read, "In memory of the brave soldiers who served and sacrificed during the Second World War. May their souls rest in peace and their legacy live on." The barracks, once a place of fear and mystery, now stood as a monument to the courage and sacrifice of those who had served. And somewhere in the beyond, James Hargrove and his comrades watched over the memorial, their souls finally at peace. The legend of the haunted barracks lived on, but it was now a tale of hope and peace. People visited the memorial, paying their respects to the brave soldiers who had served and sacrificed. And somewhere in the beyond, James Hargrove and his comrades watched over the memorial, their souls finally at peace. The barracks, once a place of fear and mystery, now stood as a monument to the courage and sacrifice of those who had served. And somewhere in the beyond, James Hargrove and his comrades watched over the memorial, their souls finally at peace.